Are there actually good arguments in support of the first premise of the Kalam Cosmological Argument? That first premise says, whatever begins to exist has a cause. My guest is Dr. Josh Rasmussen, a professor of philosophy at Asuza Pacific University. Here is this week's question. Are eliminativist views of material constitution, for example, Mereological nihilism, compatible with inductive arguments supporting the first premise of some formulation of the Kalam Cosmological Argument? There seems to be less inductive support for whatever begins to exist has a cause if there never is a case of something coming to exist by way of an arrangement of particles. Most of our examples of something coming to exist with a cause are things coming into existence by way of arrangement of particles. What do you think?
All right, well, this is a great question. And I actually got a form of this question a few years ago, and I posted an answer on my website. So I have a link in my notes that I can offer to you if you want to post that. And I thought first I would just give a little bit of context for the question, sort of to set up the question, and then offer some responses. So the context is the Kalam Cosmological Argument, which one formulation of it would go like this. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. And the question is about that first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause, and it's about the reason to think it's true. Why think it's true that whatever begins to exist has a cause? And in thinking about that premise, you can think about the different types of support that one could give. And I've divided all the types into two categories. There's supports that make appeal to experience, and then supports that make appeal to reason. And then there are subdivisions within those. Within the supports based on experience, I identified two different types of supports. One would be the inductive support, which is what the questioner was pointing to. This would be support based on our experience with beginnings of existence that have a cause. So the idea is you observe that this beginning has a cause, this one has a cause, and then you have this kind of extrapolation to all beginnings have a cause. So that's a kind of support. And so we're going to focus in on that. Another kind of support, which is different, would be from our lack of experience with uncaused beginnings. So it's not just that we experience beginnings have a cause, it's that we don't experience arbitrary chunks of matter coming into existence uncaused. So it's a lack of experience. And that's a different kind of consideration. I'm going to say a little more about both of those. So how is Mereological nihilism relevant to this? Well, Mereological nihilism, this is this view in the philosophy of parts and wholes, which says that basically there aren't any things that have parts. Everything is a simple. So you're a nihilist with respect to wholes. You don't think there are wholes. And one kind of motivation for this is that there are some paradoxes with respect to identifying what makes one thing a whole and not a whole. For example, if you think of like a statue, how many elements come together to make it a statue versus not a statue? Maybe it's just a heap of particles. Like what accounts for the difference? And there are paradoxes. And one sort of clean response to these things is just to say, well, one idea is to say that everything forms a whole. This is Mereological universalism. And some people think, well, that's too outlandish. My nose and the moon don't form a whole. And so then you take the other route and you say nothing forms a whole. This is Mereological nihilism. So if Mereological nihilism is true, then the only time something begins to exist is if it's not a whole, but rather it's a simple that comes into being. And the worry here is that we actually don't have examples of simples that come into being. What we have are arrangements that begin. Okay, but these aren't things. If there are no wholes that are things, then a table, for example, is not a thing. It's just an arrangement of things. And so then we can't say that whatever thing begins to exist has a cause. At least it's hard to see what support there would be for that premise if the support we're looking for is going to be based on examples of things that begin to exist. And we don't have examples of that. So does that make sense as a way of kind of setting up the worry?
You explain that very well.
All right. So the other thing I have here in my notes is just to distinguish between what's called an undercutting defeater of a premise, where you can just think of this as like cutting off the legs of an argument. You take out the supports of the premise, versus a rebutting defeater where you give a positive argument against a premise. So this kind of worry for Mereological nihilism, it's not a rebutting defeater. It's not saying that we can see now, because Mereological nihilism is true, that whatever begins to exist doesn't have a cause. It's not that. It's that we don't have an adequate justification, at least not from induction, for thinking that it would have a cause. So we're undercutting or defeating one of the supports. All right, so that's the setup. And I've got 3 responses for consideration. And what I like to do is just give these responses to your viewers to toy with and to think about. I think each one of these deserves more thought and is open to further development. But I think these are helpful responses to clarify what's at stake. Okay, so first, the objection from Mereological nihilism at best only targets one type of support for premise 1. And the person who asked the question was recognizing that it was focused on inductive support. This is support based on examples of beginnings of existence. That leaves 2 other potential types of support that I mentioned. One was based on reason. Just to illustrate briefly, you might argue for this first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, based on a more general principle of explanation. Like you might think that things cannot just happen or begin without any explanation at all. You might have this kind of intuition from reason that beginnings call for explanation. Or you might have a more modest principle, like the best explanation of an event is more likely, other things being equal, than no explanation. And that would be enough to give some support for the principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause. It's giving some weight to it, not as a proof, but as some evidence. So there's more to explore there, but I wanted to focus on arguments from experience. So one of the arguments from experience that I mentioned is from a lack of experience with uncaused things. We don't observe blue blobs coming into existence uncaused. You might wonder why. Why don't we observe that? Sometimes I like to tell the story of this cockroach problem that we had in our house. And these big bugs would come out and it was gross, nasty. We needed to solve this problem. How are we going to do it? Well, we blocked the likely entrances. So there was some holes under our sink and we blocked those. And sure enough, once those were blocked, those roaches didn't come into being because we blocked the possibility of them coming into being from the outside. Coming into being? What am I saying? Coming into the house, right? Mm-hmm. The whole point is that we don't observe things coming into being from non-being. But notice we didn't block the entrance from non-being. Like that's impossible. If something could come into being from non-being, I go into the sheets hoping that I don't get attacked by cockroaches. Well, what can I do? I mean, they could just come in from the land of imagination, uncaused. Well, that never happens. And so you might wonder, why doesn't that happen? Well, here's a proposal. It's a simple proposal. Roaches don't come from nothing because they can't. Because in general, things can't begin to exist uncaused. And you can make this argument even if you have no experience with things beginning to exist. You can make this argument with respect to simples. So remember, in Mereological nihilism, everything's a simple. Okay, well, I don't experience a simple dot or a flood of simple particles or whatever. I don't experience any simple sets of things, one or many, appear from nothing. And we can explain this in terms of the principle, the premise P1. Okay, so I have in my notes here a comparison. I don't observe chickens pop out of existence uncaused, and that's probably because that can't happen. So there are many examples, I think, that illustrate this kind of reasoning from what we don't observe. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's one kind of response. And then my next response would be to go ahead and just assume that Mereological nihilism is true, again, and also let's go ahead and see if there are actually examples, even if Mereological nihilism is true, that can support the inductive evidence. Now, I think the questioner is right to say that maybe you lose some support because there are some things that we might have thought counted as things, and we can't include them as things. But still, what about your existence? Okay, did you begin to exist? Well, at least you do exist, and presumably you didn't exist at the Big Bang. I mean, you could sort of ask your parents, like, hey, did I exist at the Big Bang, or did I begin to exist?
Yeah.
Maybe they can help you figure that out.
I think most people will be willing to admit that they exist.
the beginning of your existence, the idea that you began to exist, that's consistent with Mereological nihilism. Because if Mereological nihilism is true, then what that means is that everything's a simple. So that means that you must be a simple self. You're not a material arrangement. But this guy who came to Notre Dame, his argument was that Mereological nihilism is true, but that if I exist, then I would be a complex thing. I would have parts. I'd be a material arrangement. Because he's a materialist. So he wouldn't think that I'm a simple self. That sounds too much like a soul or something. So his solution then was to shave off my existence and his own existence. So that's another path to the non-existence of people. So one can find ways of arguing against things that might seem intuitive. I would turn this around and say, hey, look, I'm aware of my existence through the sort of inner light of introspection. This gives me reason to think that I exist, and my existence is compatible with Mereological nihilism. But if you think that, see, what I would suggest is that if you actually think that you exist, but you think that you are a material complex, then I think the right thing to do here is to deny Mereological nihilism. And so then the objection from Mereological nihilism goes away. So this is kind of a friendly response. I mean, if you're a materialist, you think you exist, now you have a reason to doubt Mereological nihilism. Okay, so that's a possible response there. The other thing I have here is, even if there's questions about your own existence, like maybe there's these ideas that like you've always existed, you are an eternal soul, you never began. What about your thoughts? Did some of your thoughts begin to exist? Did some of the thoughts begin in your own mind? And if so, then there you have an example, something that began to exist. And presumably your thoughts aren't uncaused, at least the ones that are based on reason,
right,
are caused by hopefully rational factors or rational reasons. And so if you have any rational thoughts, then those thoughts would be caused by rational factors. So that gives you some inductive evidence, I think. Okay. Now finally, my third response is that this principle, P1, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, I think it's supported by a more general principle that beginnings in general have a cause. So even if the only beginnings you see are rearrangements, still the causal order with respect to rearrangements supports the general principle that predicts this set of observations. It predicts that every beginning has a cause. That's because the general principle successfully predicts the restricted principle. So as a comparison, take all the coffee mugs you know about. Probably they all have a cause. I mean, even if they're just rearrangements, those rearrangements of molecules are caused by prior, whoever put those cups together or whatever factory produced them.
Yeah.
And I think that that's evidence that probably even the coffee mugs you don't know about have a cause. So you extrapolate from the known cases into the unknown cases. So the idea here is that if every arrangement you know about has a cause, then unless you have some independent reason to think that there's a relevant difference between arrangements and non-arrangements, you have evidence for thinking that every beginning has a cause. And that's sort of a key point there, is that if there's a reason to think there's a relevant difference, okay, then you could perhaps break the argument. But it's not enough to point to a difference. You need some reason to think there's a relevant difference. It's like if somebody says, oh, look, all these blue things have a cause, but we've never seen red things have a cause. Okay, but the difference between blue and red, is that a relevant difference between cause and uncause? It doesn't seem relevant. And so unless you have a relevant difference, you've got some reason to think the difference is relevant, then your observations of arrangements being caused is evidence for the general principle that any beginning has a cause. It's evidence. And I think it's evidence. I think it's good evidence. So that's it. Those are my responses to the worry. And I think that those responses help clarify what's at stake.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rasmussen. I really enjoyed that. If you have a question that you'd like to ask a scholar, then consider going to www.patreon.com/ccapologetics and sign up for level 2 or level 3. Each week I collect questions and I'll select one, contact a scholar, and make a video like this. Also, if you'd like to hear more from Dr. Rasmussen, then check out my interview with him on his book, How Reason Can Lead to God. Thanks. See you soon.